Playing the waiver wire is important in fantasy leagues and can make or break seasons. For this waiver wire entry, we will take a look at Jacksonville Jaguars tight end Evan Engram's fantasy profile and determine whether or not he's a player you should be picking up off the waiver wire. We'll start with some of the positives from Evan Engram's fantasy profile. He's been involved early on. Evan Engram has gotten decent workloads to start the 2022 season. In Week 1 against the Washington Commanders, he played 71% of the offensive snaps and caught 4 passes on 4 targets for 28 receiving yards. And in Week 2 against the Indianapolis Colts, he played 69% of the offensive snaps and caught 7 passes on 8 targets for 46 receiving yards. The next thing I really like about Evan Engram's fantasy profile is that he plays for Doug Pederson, the tight end whisperer. One of the biggest draws from Evan Engram's fantasy profile this year is the fact that head coach Doug Pederson is the team's offensive play caller. Pederson has been one of the best coaches in the league at utilizing the tight end position in the passing game over the course of his 130 games as an offensive coordinator or head coach, with the group averaging at least 10 targets per game during his entire career as the Philadelphia Eagles head coach from 2016 to 2020. Playing for a tight end friendly coach means that Engram will have all the opportunity in the world this year and increases his chances of being fantasy relevant. The last thing I really like about Evan Engram's fantasy profile is his athleticism. Evan Engram is one of the more athletic tight ends in the league, with a 4.42 40-yard dash speed and his burst score, agility score, and catch radius all ranking in the 85th percentile or better for tight ends according to Player Profiler. Having great athleticism is good news if you're looking to draft Engram. Moving on to some of the concerns with Evan Engram's fantasy profile. He's been a bust in the past. Evan Engram was drafted in the first round of the 2017 NFL Draft, but didn't live up to the hype for the New York Giants after his strong rookie year, consistently struggling with drops and some injuries. Because of this, it may be harder for fantasy players to trust him, since he's burned quite a few people in the past. The next major concern I have with Evan Engram's fantasy profile is his low yards per reception. It has only been 2 weeks, but as of right now, Engram is averaging just 6.7 yards per reception, after averaging a career low 8.9 yards per reception in 2021. This is concerning because with such a low yards per reception, Engram will not generate as many fantasy points per reception as other tight end options, and that means that he'll be more reliant on volume compared to other fantasy tight ends. The last major thing that concerns me about Evan Engram's fantasy profile is his 2021 fantasy numbers. During the 2021 season, Evan Engram finished as the TE23 in standard, with 56.5 total fantasy points and 3.8 fantasy points per game. The TE23 in half PPR formats, with 79.5 total fantasy points and 5.3 fantasy points per game, and the TE23 in full PPR formats, with 102.5 total fantasy points and 6.8 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, he had just 7 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 7 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, and just 1 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points according to fantasy data. These aren't playable numbers in most leagues, so he definitely needs to be better than his 2021 self in order to be fantasy relevant in 2022. Some additional thoughts on Evan Engram's fantasy profile. Trevor Lawrence. The Jacksonville Jaguars starting quarterback Trevor Lawrence had a rough rookie season last year, where he completed 359 passes on 602 passing attempts for 3,641 passing yards and 12 passing touchdowns to 17 interceptions. He was billed as a generational QB going into the 2021 NFL Draft, and he's looked pretty good so far in the first 2 weeks of the 2022 season, but we'll have to see if it continues and Lawrence is able to support multiple fantasy-relevant pass catchers. Competition for targets. Christian Kirk has appeared to cement himself as the clear number 1 pass-catching option on the Jaguars, based on his performance in the first 2 weeks of the season. The Jaguars also have wide receivers Zay Jones and Marvin Jones seeing similar target workloads to Evan Engram through 2 weeks. Because of this, it's hard to say if there's a true number 2 pass catcher on the Jaguars right now, as their number 2 through number 4 options are all getting similar usage. Personal opinion: Evan Engram was my favorite late round tight end target this year because of Doug Pederson's traditionally tight end friendly offense. And while he hasn't had a boom game yet, his usage is what you look for in a tight end if you don't have a clear set and forget option, like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts once he turns it around, George Kittle once he gets healthy, Darren Waller, and Dallas Goedert, among others. I think he's a guy that is going to be a low-end tight end 1 this year and finish the season in the TE8 to TE12 range. If he's still on waivers in 12-team leagues and you have been disappointed in your tight end's fantasy production, I would pick up Engram.
And that's it for today's waiver entry. If you have a player that you'd like to see covered, drop a comment below.